Welcome to the Latter-day Freemen podcast, a podcast dedicated to building a movement of Latter-day Saints, united in defense of the principles of freedom and our inspired Constitution. I am your host, Jacob Hibbard, and I'm joined as I am each week by my fellow Freemen, by Jeremy Andersen. Jeremy, thanks so much for being here tonight. It's just the two of us. It's a little bit of a lonely crowd, but I think we'll have a great discussion anyway. So this week, we are covering the final pillar. So as we said near the beginning of our podcast, President Benson gave us what we call the pillars of America, the principles or key principles that our country is founded upon that made it a free and prosperous society, what made America great. And tonight we are talking about the final pillar, and that is the pillar of free markets, the right to exchange, the freedom to choose in an economic sphere. And to kind of set the tone for our discussion, I wanted to bring an example of perhaps a viewpoint that is not necessarily in line with that view of free markets. And unfortunately, we live in a society, and I think you'd agree with this, Jeremy, where there's a lot of criticism and opposition to the concept of free markets, or I guess you could say capitalism. I tend to use them interchangeably. I know there are people who draw distinctions between the two, and I think that there's interesting discussions around that. But for the purpose of our discussion tonight, I'm going to use it interchangeably. But I was able to pick one quote out of the many that were critical of free markets, and this quote comes from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was on the Stephen Colbert Show in January of 2019, and as part of her discussion with Stephen Colbert, she said, "I do think that a system that allows billionaires to exist when there are parts of Alabama where people are getting ringworm because they don't have access to public health is wrong." And in other environments, she's also said that capitalism as a system is irredeemable. There are lots of, like I said, there are plenty of other quotes I could have pulled in varying degrees of criticism towards the concept of free markets. Even people on the right, Senator Marco Rubio, Senators Josh Hawley, and a lot of other figures on the right, Tucker Carlson, also have been critical as of late of the concept of free markets and capitalism. So knowing that this is such a fraught issue with a variety of critiques being leveled towards it and an opposition and what seems on all sides, that raises the question for us as Latter-day Freemen. If we know that free markets is a pillar of America, does that mean then that is the free market system a moral system that we as Latter-day Saints should embrace? Jeremy, what's your response to that?
So I think the short answer obviously is yes, it's a moral system. But there's a little bit more, I guess you could say, nuance to the question than just that. And for me, I almost want to dive into what is a free market a little bit more so we can talk about, why it is moral and what that basis is on.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the key to understanding why a free market system is moral is what the base it rests on. President Benson said that the free market system rests on a moral base, and I think, like you said, we need to examine then what that base is to understand why it's moral. But before we jump into that, I wanted to share a few quotes that I found preparing for this discussion just about how Latter-day Saints, or how the concept of free markets aligns with revealed religion. And one of the quotes that I found that I really liked came from Elder Marky Peterson of the Quorum of the 12, where he said, "How many of the Latter-day Saints truly believe in the Constitution of the United States? That Constitution stands for free initiative, that is free agency. In a business sense, we have spoken of it as free private enterprise. Capitalism is an outgrowth of free enterprise in business. Free enterprise in business is an outgrowth of free enterprise in a general sense, and free enterprise in a general sense is free agency, the principle to which Latter-day Saints are committed." And another quote I found from another apostle, Elder Stephen L. Richards, also talks about how the capitalist system in its essence is anything more than man's free right to work, to choose his work, to enjoy the rewards of his efforts. So from prophets and apostles, in terms of what free markets are, and why, I guess, starting that conversation that you brought up, Jeremy, why they are moral, why it's a moral system, is because at its root, it's based on for the freedom to choose, or agency, or liberty applied to an economic sphere. And that, to me, we know that individual liberty is the first pillar of America, and so free markets then is just applying that pillar into a very important part of our society.
Right. Yeah, and I think with this particular quote you shared from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the things that is a little bit deceptive about it is she says, I don't think billionaires should exist when there are poor people, when there's these conditions due to poverty, essentially, or poor health outcomes. So she's saying that I don't think that we should have billionaires when we have people that still have ringworm, but she's missing the point that we just let people have what they want. And when people see something they want, they are free to work towards getting that. And that's kind of what I see as the free market system, is this ability to work towards things. It puts the onus of my situation on me and says, I'm responsible for making sure that I have adequate health care, making sure that I have enough money, that I have enough food. That's my responsibility, rather than everybody just needs to be at a certain level.
I think it also misses the fact that no system in human history has a better track record of raising people out of poverty than free markets or capitalism. If you look at how the trend lines for global poverty, I mean, billions and billions of people are being lifted out of extreme poverty, not because of some sort of central plan that bureaucrats came up with to design their economy, but as free market systems have expanded, the principles of free markets have grown, prosperity has been the natural result, because the free market system is built on eternal principles. And as we know in the scriptures that we can't gain any blessing without following a divine law, capitalism or free markets is built on divine laws, and the blessing that comes is prosperity. And I wanted to get into a few of what these principles are. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the first broad principle, like the broadest way of saying, is that free markets is built on the freedom to choose. President Benson, in an article he wrote called "Title of Liberty," he says, "Our abundant material blessings have come to us through an economic system that rests largely on three pillars: free enterprise, the right to venture, the right to choose; private property, the right to own, develop, and enjoy; and then the last one, a market economy, the right to exchange and to profit." And he said, "We must never make the catastrophic blunder of putting the chains of big government on our basic economic freedom." So there we get the idea that, the right to choose, to venture, the right private property, right to own, and a market system where you have the right to exchange and profit according to your own will. Cleon Skousen, in his book "How to Save the Constitution," called it the four freedoms of the free market: the freedom to try, the freedom to buy, the freedom to sell, and the freedom to fail. And it's these freedoms, or the fact that free markets are built on these freedoms, that creates prosperity. And it's a natural law. When you respect agency, and when you respect private property and allow people to exercise their property rights, to own and control, choose what they do with their own property, to choose who they want to do business with, on what terms, to buy what they want to buy, assuming it's a willing seller, and to sell to who they want to sell, assuming it's a willing buyer, prosperity is a result. And I think because we are acting in harmony with the divine principles of freedom of choice and private property.
But what I really like about breaking down the free market system into those freedoms to try, freedoms to buy, to sell, freedom to fail. I really like this framework because it gives us a way of thinking about it and measuring policies. When we look at a policy, we can say, is it infringing on one of these very concrete freedoms, as opposed to oftentimes, I know for me, when I'm first encountering these policies, it's kind of like, well, is this a good idea or is it a bad idea? I don't really know. What is it even? Why is it there? There's probably a good reason that they're putting it forward. Why would they go to the trouble of doing all this? And of course they have reasons, and it's hard to evaluate, is this a good idea or is it a bad idea? But if you have this model in your mind of what a free market is and how it should work, then you can start to say, well, if I do this, am I making it so that somebody can't fail? Am I making it so that somebody can't buy, somebody can't sell? And if that's the case, it lifts the burden of proof it raises the bar to pass that law quite a bit, because these freedoms, this is what our economic system is built on. This is where we get our abundance. In another speech, President Benson said, he said this in his speech, The Proper Role of Government, quote, "Economic security for all is impossible without widespread abundance. Abundance is impossible without industrious and efficient production. Such production is impossible without energetic, willing, and eager labor. This is not possible without incentive." And I'm going to break out for a second. When he says incentive there, he's going back to that idea of free agency. You can't get industrious and efficient production out of slave labor. You only get it out of people that are doing this with their own volition and putting their own creative energy into it. So continuing his quote, he says, "Of all forms of incentive, the freedom to attain a reward for one's labors is the most sustaining for most people. Sometimes called the profit motive, it is simply the right to plan and to earn and to enjoy the fruits of your labor. This profit motive diminishes as government controls, regulations, and taxes increase to deny the fruits of success to those who produce. Therefore, any attempt through governmental intervention to redistribute the material rewards of labor can only result in the eventual destruction of the productive base of society, without which real abundance and security for more than the ruling elite is quite impossible." I love how logical this is.
Well, I also love how well it lines up with the framework that you described, Jeremy, as well, and how when we break down the free market into those freedoms, the freedom to choose, to buy, to sell, to try, to fail, that it gives us a way, like you said, to evaluate policy. And there are so many different policies that get proposed that impact the economy that can cross or violate one of those core freedoms that we have, that deprive people of the opportunity to buy from who they want to buy, or to sell to whom they want to sell, or conversely, to not buy from certain people or to not sell to certain people. And it reminded me of a quote from President McKay, where he said that true liberty means to purchase what one wants to purchase, and to sell what he wishes to sell without public interference. And then Ezra and Andersen, in his book, Many Are Called But Few Are Chosen, he gives an interesting commentary on when we don't allow people to exercise those freedoms, to have that incentive, not only to destroy the engines of abundance, like you were talking about, Jeremy, but he says when we use the police power to prevent our fellow men from buying goods and services from whomsoever they desire, we are treating them as children or mental incompetents who are unable to make their own decisions. We are either prohibiting them from purchasing a desired commodity or service, or compelling them to trade with someone they would not have patronized had we allowed them their freedom in the matter. And so often, when we talk about policies, like you said, Jeremy, I don't think, maybe there are very few exceptions to this, but I think nobody has genuinely proposed a policy that they thought was bad, or that was not going to accomplish something good, that they thought was good. However, when we use the framework of how does this impact freedoms, and then specifically in an economic sense, how does this impact the pillars of the free market system, the freedom to choose, private property, and then the associated freedoms we've talked about, unfortunately, what we discover is that good intentioned policy, whether it means, whether it's redistributing wealth, different types of regulations, tariffs, all sorts of different, there's a lot of ways we could do that, policies that could be like this, despite our intentions that could be good, but probably aren't good, they violate these principles. They treat our fellow citizens as children or mental incompetence, and it violates their freedom to choose. It violates their natural rights in their economic natural rights, which are just as valuable and just as inherent and deserve just as much respect as their other rights, such as freedom of speech, the right to life, etc.
Going back to the initial initial question that you put forward, is the free market system a moral system? I think when you look at that question, you have to realize the free market system does not create morality. It creates abundance. If you look at the Book of Mormon, there's several instances throughout where Mormon or Moroni brings up the fact that the people were able to trade freely and they did it to get gain. In Ether, he talks about it with the Jaredites during a time when they're not particularly righteous, but because they're trafficking freely, they get gain and they're wealthy. He talks about it, I don't remember now, earlier in another...
The Lamanites, it talks about this specifically, where the Lamanites, after Amulon and the priests of Noah go and join up with them, they teach them how to write, they teach them language, and they start to, even though they're a wicked people, they start to engage in trade and commerce, and it creates all this abundance for them. So I think that was the one that you were thinking.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. It says that they began to increase in riches, began to trade with one another, and wax great. So even though they're wicked, they're reaping this abundance, this benefit in material wealth because they're trading freely. And in Helaman, there's only one instance that I remember here where the people are righteous and they're trading freely and they see the blessings as well. So it's not necessarily, that's in Helaman 6, verses 7 through 9, where there's this last example. It's not necessarily that the free market system creates morality. It doesn't. It creates wealth. But it creates wealth because it's built on those eternal principles that you were talking about. It's built on this idea of free agency and honoring people's free agency. And so when it's applied properly, when we do honor people's free agency as a government and then as individuals, we see this abundance. And I think anywhere that we start to really honor the principles that the Lord has set forth, we're going to see free markets take root, because it's a natural outgrowth of giving people their free agency is free markets.
Yeah, I really love the language that Mormon uses in Helaman 6, where he says, "Thus they did have free intercourse one with another, to buy and to sell, and to get gain according to their desire. And it came to pass that they became exceedingly rich, both the Lamanites and the Nephites." And so when you have this mutual exchange, you're respecting rights on both sides, there is an increase in wealth. It's the natural law result of abiding by these principles. And further, when it's like you said, it doesn't make people moral in the sense that if you just do the bare minimum of respecting people's rights, but are morally corrupt in other ways, like the Lamanites were when the Amulonites come in and teach them, you still will reap the benefits or the blessings, I guess you could say, of abiding even just by that bare minimum of respecting people's rights in that way. And it's also a moral system because every other economic system that exists and that has existed falls short in a key way. Stephen L. Richards says, speaking of free enterprise and speaking specifically of ours in America, he said, is the only tried and tested system of free enterprise in this world. And every other opposing system is built on an abridgment of personal liberty. And so when you stray from the free market, you are going to inevitably trample on the rights of someone else. And not just their right to choose in terms of like who they buy and sell from, but also private property. And private property is a divine principle. President Howard W. Hunter, in a talk he gave called the Law of the Harvest, he said the right to own and control private property is not only a human right, it is a divine right. And as we've referred to this scripture as well many times in our podcast, D&C section 134, verse 2, that no government can exist in peace unless such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure the right to own and control property. And so the free market system respects in every sense the freedom of choice and to all the different ways that you can choose, but then also fully respects private property rights. And that then, as a result, government, as we talked about in the proper role of government pillar, and when you apply the proper role of government then to this pillar together, we discover that the proper role of government within the economy is not to pick winners and losers, not to decide who you do business with or how you do business with or how you use your property, but is to secure your right to choose who you do business with, to decide what career you want to pursue, what business you want to open, to secure all those rights to buy, to try, to sell, and to secure your private property. And as a result of doing that, it creates all this abundance. And the scriptures you shared from the Book of Mormon evidence that. And then also in our own world, when we have the evidence, we have the fruit of this tree.
Yep, I love that. So going at the beginning, we quoted Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and she kind of takes a hit at billionaires. And I think that's a really kind of common attack to make on the free market system. So maybe it's worth addressing a little bit. I know I have a friend who recently told me, nobody really needs to have that much money. There's just no need for anyone to have billions of dollars. And it's when you think about it, it's kind of true. Like, sure, nobody does need to have $1 billion or more. And so why is it okay for them to have that, especially when somebody else doesn't have enough? They're living paycheck to paycheck. They can't pay their rent. They're getting evicted and things along these lines. And it goes back to this basic premise of respecting people's agency. And it also goes back to this idea of private property. And America was founded on the idea of private property. One of the main reasons that the founders wanted to leave Great Britain is because they felt their private property was being taken from them without representation, that they didn't have a say in whether they were being taxed or not. And they believed so strongly in the importance of private property that they were willing to sign the Declaration of Independence, go through the war, the Revolutionary War, and establish their own form of government, even though several of them really liked the British government and they identified as Englishmen. When they started to see that they weren't having their private property respected, that was one of the things that pushed them to declare independence. But now that's another thing that is commonly attacked. And the idea is put forward, well, why don't we just have common property? instead of private property, why don't we say, well, property just belongs to everybody, and all you have to do is just take what you need and not take more than you need. Then we won't have billionaires. We won't have poor people. We'll all have just plenty of stuff, because in America we've got plenty of stuff and we always have. And so just have common property. What would you say to that kind of an argument, Jacob?
Well, you would have poor people, a lot more poor people, unfortunately, because when you don't respect the rights of individuals, specifically property rights and the freedom to choose, you destroy the profit motive. So any incentive people will have to create wealth, create abundance, to create all these things that we need will be gone. And there might be some here or there, but overall, you're going to have a lot less of it. To do that system, to create communal property, you'd have to violate these rights. And it also goes back to what's commonly known as the tragedy of the commons. When there is no private property, when there's no sense of ownership, people don't take care of things. They don't respect things. They don't exercise them in a efficient manner, in a way that's productive. And so common property would all just, fall to pieces. A good example, like the ocean. There's no real property rights in the ocean. That's why there's so much trash in it. But when you have some ownership or feel, and there's an attachment to you and something, the way you take care of it, the way you treat it, the way you conduct yourself completely changes. And I just said with what Representative Ocasio-Cortez said, and this concern of billionaires, and maybe this is unpopular, and I don't care that Jeff Bezos has billions of dollars and I don't. It doesn't hurt me that he has more money than I do. He didn't take it from me. Any money that Jeff Bezos got of mine, I gave to him voluntarily. Jeff Bezos and his brute squad didn't show up outside my door and demand that I subscribe to Amazon Prime. And so in a free market system where the use of force or fraud is barred from interactions, people can only become successful through voluntary transactions and through being creative and innovating. And if we have common property and we can't enjoy the fruits of our labor, that you just crush that. And I don't think that the concept of leveling the world is aligned with gospel principles. When we look at the parable of the talents, Christ gives, the master gives to his servants. He gives one of them 5 talents. He gives one of them 2 and one of them 1. And they all, use talents that they've been given, and they use it differently. And at the end of the day, the one who was given 5 has 10. The one who was given 2 has 4. And the one who had 1 didn't do anything with it. And the Lord doesn't then, the master in the parable doesn't then take the talents from the 10, some of the talents from the 10 to make the one who had 4 have equal with him. They don't give it to the one who just had 1. In fact, he takes it from the 1 and gives it the one with 10, which is interesting. But that distracts a little bit from the point, is that God has given us talents. He's given us abilities, and he blesses us and rewards us as we use them and as we're creative with them. And there comes a natural entitlement to the fruits, to the rewards and the fruits of those things that we gain through the use of our talents, are all just acquisitions. And God fully respects those rights. God, in the end, God's given us everything, but even then he asks that we pay our tithing. He asks that we be charitable. He does not demand it. He does not force it. And because he recognizes and respects the natural right that we have then to property and our agency. And so while the concept of having everything in common perfectly like that, where everyone just takes what their needs, might sound nice, I don't think it sounds nice. And I think we have a history, mostly the 20th century, where we can show that it really doesn't work. It conflicts against human nature and it conflicts against natural law.
Yeah, what you're saying, it reminds me of a quote from President Benson. This is one of our quotes in the Pillar of Free Markets. And Ezra Taft Benson said, "To continue to enjoy present blessings we must return to these basic and fundamental principles. Economics and morals are both part of one inseparable body of truth. They must be in harmony. We need to square our actions with these eternal verities. He said that in a talk called Watchmen, Warn the Wicked. And it's like you were saying, if we remove this private property and we stop respecting people's rights, then we will cease to enjoy the present blessings. We have those blessings because of the free market system. And if we want to continue to have those blessings, we don't have to, but if we want to, then we need to preserve the basic fundamental principles that caused us to acquire them in the first place. Yeah.
And if we want to act in accordance with eternal principles, just generally speaking, we have to respect and secure those freedoms, those rights. And so both we have, you could almost say there's a moral argument, purely moral argument, and there's a consequentialist argument or a utilitarian argument. From a utilitarian perspective, if you want prosperity, you want to follow these principles. But then just from a purely principles-based of what is right and wrong, a free market system is moral because it respects those principles of freedom of choice and of private property. And when we stray from a free market system, for whatever reason, whatever good reason we might have, we infringe on private property rights and the rights of others to choose, and we are doing something that is immoral and is wrong. I think it would be really great for us to dive in to talk about things such as, the United Order and the duty and the responsibility we have as members of the church to take care of the poor. I think those would be great topics for future podcasts. But what we really want to get across tonight is that when someone says that the free market system is immoral and then proposes these different policies that he goes away from it, we have to recognize that not only are we choking the fountain of prosperity and abundance, but we in the process, we're also infringing on the rights of our brothers and sisters. And as such, we will reap both, kind of eternal consequences of violating other people's rights, but then also material consequences as a result of going against natural law. And I think that's part of the reason why this pillar is so important to defending and understanding. And like I said, there's a lot of application ways and things that we can get into of how these principles apply to different policies. But I think, like you said, Jeremy, as you use the measuring rod of the freedom to use, the freedom to enjoy your private property and the different freedoms associated with free markets, we can have that toolkit and that framework to evaluate what we're seeing and hopefully stand on the side of freedom, on the side of free markets, on the side of prosperity, and respecting each other as individuals and respecting each other's rights. Any concluding thoughts, Jeremy, before we end?
I think that was a great wrap up.
Awesome. Well, folks, we're going to wrap it up here. Don't forget to be sure to like and subscribe and to follow us on whatever podcasting platform that you use. If you can, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps out the show, helps us get our message out to more people. We really appreciate your support. Those of you who've already left such nice comments and reviews, we really do appreciate your support. If you have a topic that you'd like to see addressed on the show, or you'd like to contact us, you can contact us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are active on all of those platforms, or you can email the show directly at latterdayfreemen76@gmail.com. Well, for Jeremy, thank you again for joining us tonight, and we will see you next week.